there. Because nowadays, in postmodern disciplines, they consider that Orientalism was a kind of like an out of date field that denotes to the people from the Orient, and it tends to be associated with an offensive stereotype about the Orient. You know, when you say that someone from the Orient, it means that maybe he is less skillful, maybe he's ignorant, maybe he's a dervish, maybe he's different things which are less in quality than the things that we have in the West. Oh, infuriating, this is the word. And that's why you would have only specialized dictionaries who would tell you what is Orientalism, because they are trying to remove this from the literature of the West nowadays. Here I'm talking about the West, but the West is a very generic term, as you know, and perhaps to be more accurate, we'll be talking about two categories of the West, two areas. It is Europe as one whole continent, and America, because both of them can be called as the West in our literature. And before the World War II, most of the West was dominated by the imperial powers of France and Britain. And we know that how gigantic the British Empire was in the past. And after that, the states took over from them, and it became maybe the solely controller of maybe the whole world by its strong economy, by its military, by its different methods of domination. But the relationship between the Orient and Europe was more distinguished and more and stronger than the relationship between the Orient and the States. This is due to several reasons. First of all, is that the history of the States itself is just like 500 centuries or so, which is not very old enough to have like an upper hand in the Orient. But the history of Europe itself is very remote and covers different times of domination and exercise of power in the Orient. So for Europe, the Orient was the richest and the greatest and the oldest colonies, because they had like colonies, musta'marat, in everywhere, in Africa, in Asia, because the Orient here could be applicable to Africa, the Middle East, Far East, all these Near East, Middle East, Far East. They were all in general called as the Orient, as opposite to the Occident. So for Europe, the Orient was more closer and more of some interest to it, because it has its colonies there. So there was more relation between Europe and the Orient. The second reason is that it's because of its geographical adjacency to Europe, because for the States, the Orient is a bit far, unlike the case of Europe. So this proximity would allow for a kind of an interaction and closeness with this Orient. The third reason for this relationship between the Orient and Europe as well, it is because of the West or the Occident seeing it as superior. And it is usually the attitude of someone in order to show their supremacy and superiority over someone else. They need to create an image. They need to create an entity that they can compare their personality, their character, their entity against them. When I say I'm tall, which is not true, when I say I'm tall, this kind of high stature has to have something else which is short, so I can show you how tall I am. Right? So this is how the notion went on in the West. We want to, show people that we are the superior, so we need a contrast, a cultural contestant, which is a bit inferior, so we can present ourselves well in front of them. Right? So our superiority is in comparison with all non-European backwardness. متخلفين. شوف عندنا ايه هم عندهم ايه. And you probably might, even till now, when you see that kind of misrepresentation of the Orient, or maybe if the Middle East or the Arabs or Muslims, and we will come in a bit and say that the Orient was something associated with Islam, because for them they had more interest in that empire that was dominating the whole of the world, and they wanted to encounter it in some way. So their disguised attitude was against the Orient or dealing with the Orient, but in fact it was against Islam. The other motive that drove the West to have an interest in the Orient as well is that kind of civilization and cultural input that Europe itself had some integrated parts from the Orient into its own culture and its own traditions. When you look into the depth of the European Western culture, you find lots of the Arabic, Islamic, Oriental traditions based and based and embedded in the Western culture. Talking about the language, talking about people from the Orient who became like citizens of Europe, talking about scholarship. As I said earlier, until the 17th century, Ibn Sina's books on medicine were still studied in Europe as the major primary textbooks for medicines. So in practice, the West, especially Europe, owes a lot of its scholarship to the inputs from the Orient. So for some reason, there was an integral part in Europe coming from the Orient. That's what created more interest in the Westerners or the Orientalists into the study of this Orient, unlike the case of America, which only could have all this kind of scholarship from Europe in a secondary step. Here, as you will see in this book, the Orient was seen as an imaginative figure, an imaginative entity that people imagine. It is not based on real study, or it's not based on objective, critical understanding of the reality of what I see and observe, but it was based on my own observation and understanding of what I see, and I'm at full liberty to transfer it and to explain it to my people in the West in the way I interpret it and see it. Okay? That's why in modern disciplines,